Hi, this is Jamie Carberry, and I am a Master of Early Childhood Education candidate at Kennesaw State University. And I'm going to take this time to present my action research that I conducted during my Master of Education program. The title of my action research was Movement Integration and Its Effect on Student Performance and Engagement. So to begin, I'm going to discuss the purpose of my action research. And the purpose of this action research study was to see how movement integration affects student engagement and performance in the mathematics classroom. Below, you're going to see the two research questions that the study used as a focus of implementation. The first research question stated, how does movement integration affect student engagement throughout the mathematics learning block? And then the second question was, how does the implementation of movement integration through the use of flexible seating, energizer breaks, and physical activities that were planned during the math lessons affect student academic performance in mathematics? To begin, before I started planning and deciding on the data analysis and the data collection stages of my action research, I took the time to delve into literature that had already been conducted on a similar topic. So this is my summary of my literature review that I had done for my action research. First off, through the review of professional literature on research of other educators on the topic of movement integration, there were many positive findings that I discovered. First, movement integration and flexible seating are two of the hottest buzzwords right now in education. And brain research has found that physical activity like moving, stretching, walking can improve student learning, and that came from Jensen in the year 2000. Jensen also goes on to say that we know that physically active people are known to have better oxygen intake, which also increases their focus and memory, and this occurs in students as well. Students who suffer from ADHD were found to be more engaged in lessons and activities, and it was discussed in specific articles and research studies that movement and exercise also equals a fractional dose of whatever medication would for a child with ADHD. So ADHD students actually need movement in the classroom to learn. It was also found that students only need to change locations in the room for their brain to be reset. So teachers don't have to initiate these fancy movement plans during the day. Just getting your students up and moving from one place to another in the classroom is enough to reset the brain and get them back engaged. I also learned that because students' brains are still growing and developing at a young age, they do need frequent breaks for their brain to retain information. Their brains are still so young and underdeveloped that these little breaks allow their brain the opportunity to store the information and in a place where students can recall it. So after I gained my literature review and I found the findings that other educators and other experts have found, I put together a process and a methodology. So here is the methodology of my action research. Students began each math learning block every single day with a 2 to 3 minute movement energizer. These energizers varied from day to day. The students actually grew to love them, and they asked to start every math lesson with one. So it was just a time from transition from one content area to another content area, and we had a good 2 to 3 minute break where students could get up, they could move, they could take part in either a game that we played, or maybe it was just a walk around the recess field, or maybe it was I used Go Noodle a lot in my classroom to do a different movement activity. Students had the choice to participate or not participate, but if they chose not to participate in the particular event, I still had them stand up and either just kind of march in place or do arm circles. So they had to do some sort of movement. I also planned math lessons that when I was planning them as often as I could that would fit in with the standard, I would plan activities where students had the ability to move as well as collaborate with classmates. And every day during my math learning block, I had a whole group lesson and then I had an extended work time. And during this work time session, the math block, students had math centers and math activities that they moved around the room to complete, and they rotated daily. This changed student location throughout the room. So every time they changed to a different station, a different activity, the location also changed. And that went back to some of the research review that I saw in my literature review. And as well as all of those, a certain group of students were selected by me for flexible movement seats. And some of these examples were wobble stools that I received, stability balls, and then wobble cushions. And that was their flexible seating, which allowed them to fidget and move freely as they were sitting down during the lessons. So next I'm going to discuss data collection. This was a mixed methods research study. So my quantitative data, I began with the math inventory, which is a math online assessment, and I use this as my pre-test data. And the information that I took from that was used to choose students who would receive the flexible seating options, and it also helped me choose some control groups of students as well. Students received a weekly problem solver, and this was one word problem that students were to solve, and it was graded using a problem solving rubric. We practiced it a bunch just without being graded, just practicing the process. I then took a baseline, and after the baseline I used that as their starting score, and then the next following weeks they were to do it on their own, and those were the scores that I took after movement was integrated into the math classroom. And then my qualitative data, I chose to have weekly student engagement observations, and they were conducted on 5 students that were chosen by the researcher to receive these flexible seating options. Students were chosen whether or not they were an RTI student. Some of them were just low motivated students, ESL students, and then I did have a couple of students that were my control group, students that were already on level in mathematics and really did not need an intervention, and they were my on-level students to compare the engagement throughout using these movement seats. I also conducted the 20 to 30 minute observations, and I recorded the results on an engagement rubric. After the observations were completed, a percentage of on-task behavior was calculated, and this kind of also is a transition to a more quantitative area to see how on task these students were using the flexible seating options. So as I did my data analysis, here is a chart for my quantitative data for those problem solvers. And as you can see, all the way on the left are the students in my 4th grade classroom. I used their first and last initial for ethical purposes so that their identity was kept private. You can see their baseline score, what their score was on the very first problem solver that I gave to them before movement integration was added to the classroom. Then you will see problem solver 1, 2, and 3, and this was after movement integration was implemented, and my hope was to see an increase in the scores. And then the column all the way to the right is student growth. So how did they grow from the baseline to the last problem solver? And I color coded this. Students that received 0 growth, their scores stayed virtually the same. I did not change the color of those cells. Students that had a positive growth, that they increased their scores, I shaded in green, and I listed how many points they received in positive growth. And out of all of my students, I had only 1 student that had a negative growth. and it was a pretty small negative growth. So I wasn't too concerned over that, but I did color code that in orange. So you can see here the majority of my class did make some growth, and you can see how much growth each student made. And then looking at the data analysis for the qualitative data collection, this was my student engagement observations, and I had 5 students, and you can see that 2 of my students, student number 3 and student number 5, they have an asterisk next to their numbers. They were my on-level mathematics students that were my control group. These are my students that I knew probably did not need an intervention to continue to succeed in my class. My other students, students 1, 2, and 4, were students that either were on the RTI process, they were ELL learners, or they were just low motivated students. And you can see that the bars that were in blue, those are the baselines before any movement was integrated into my classroom. And you can see that with many of my students, the baseline, they did not score very high. My observation 1 was after movement had been integrated for about a week, and in all of the students, you can see that at the observation 1, their student engagement did increase. And then the gray is observation 2, and this was very inconsistent. Some students went down in their engagement, some students increased again, some students kind of stayed pretty similar. So you can see the percentage of on-task and engaged students of these 5 that received the movement chairs. So after my data was collected and analyzed, my findings, what did I find? So the findings of this study showed that student performance on weekly word problems did in fact improve with the use of movement integration in the classroom. And I had an 80% of my students in the 4th grade class improving their problem-solving scores. When the researcher analyzed the qualitative data, it was found that the use of movement seats had an inconsistent effect on student engagement. And I think that this probably requires further studying. Students were excited to use the alternative seating, and they actually preferred these chairs to traditional chairs almost 100% of the time. However, during this research study, engagement was not shown to have a significant increase. And I feel this a limitation that really hindered these results was just timing. Only working with about 4 weeks of data, I feel like was not sufficient enough. So I feel like that was a big limitation for this area. So for future research, because I feel like there were such limitations with timing, future research would be used to take this study a step further. I think that it definitely needs to be researched some more. I would like to extend this study to occur over an entire school year rather than a 4-week time slot. I also think that it would be important to involve another 4th grade classroom as a control group that does not use alternate seating or the use of movement integration. So these 2 classes will teach the same exact standards, but they will teach the content differently, with one class using movement and alternative seating, and the other class using more traditional seats as well as a more traditional instructional model, where students do not engage in movement activities to the same degree. All other instruction methods will be the same. I believe this future research will yield more accurate results to answer the research question of how does movement integration affect student engagement and performance in the mathematics classroom.